Hey Shay, how's your class going?
Well, it's the end of the semester, so that means that there's a lot of reviewing going on, which always feels like a daunting task.
It's such a crucial part of teaching, but you're right, it can seem daunting because while we understand the value in reviewing, our students don't always.
Yeah, there's nothing new when we're reviewing, so hopefully,
Hopefully.
hopefully, yeah. So it can seem pretty boring, right? It's just not fun when someone says, "Hey, it's time to review. Turn to page 30."
Right, right. But at the same time, if you skip it, let's just say the times I've skipped review, things haven't gone all so well on the assessment.
Wah, wah. Nope. So the question is, how do we make reviewing effective and engaging for students so they don't think it's a waste of time and actually achieve the learning objectives of the unit or course or whatever it is that we're reviewing? Are you ready, Anna?
I was born ready.
Oh. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shey.
And I'm Anna. Before we even get into how to make reviewing fun again,
Make reviewing fun again!
questionable episode title choice, but we're running with it, listeners.
It just sort of happened. Please excuse us.
Shit happens. But so anyway, before we get to that part, making reviewing fun is kind of the secondary part of this, right? I think we first need to talk about the effective piece of this.
It's true. So, Anna, what makes reviewing effective in your mind?
Well, I think it's kind of one of those things that I think we just kind of do subliminally, right? The point of reviewing is to reinforce what students have learned, but then there's also the second component, which is there's this assessment piece. Like you're reviewing partially because it'll benefit the student's learning, but then also you probably have some kind of assessment of their learning, like a test or a final project of some kind. So really the reviewing isn't just going to be whatever you think should be reviewed. It's what is going to be on the test. So it's the most, I guess, teaching to the test, quote unquote, component of your class.
Yeah, and so with that, I think there comes this responsibility to make sure that we're reviewing in a way that at least kind of minimally resembles the type of assessment that the students are to have, right? Preparing them for a particular format or type of task. And ideally, we're also reviewing in a way that resembles, or at least explicitly connects back to the kinds of activities that they've done throughout the process.
I think this comes back to this whole concept of this holistic teaching where you're thinking of a course with strategic objectives. Every component is working towards these learning goals. So the test reflects the reviewing, and the content of the review reflects the entire course. The learning reflects the test, but that's only because the test reflects the objectives, right?
Damn, that's a mouthful.
But
yeah. Totally.
I didn't express that so clearly, perhaps. But the idea is it all comes full circle. I don't want to say teach to the test because if a course is well designed, the tests are natural. The test is a natural manifestation of how those objectives are measured. And so it's not just about being like, this is the test, we've got to teach to it. It's more about how does this review fit into the test and how does the test fit into the course content? How does the course content address the overarching objectives?
Yes, that's so important. If we're effective in reverse engineering our class, it all comes together. And I think another piece that we need to highlight when looking at effectiveness in reviewing is that our learners shouldn't be learning anything particularly new at this stage either. Reviewing shouldn't be like this brand new sort of overwhelming, bright and shiny activity because then we're maybe missing the point of reviewing content. I think it comes back to a common thread in our discussions in that creating some sort of expectation for our students around the reviewing process, routines for reviewing, that can be really helpful in ensuring that we're not overwhelming our students with the newness of review activities and detracting from our purpose.
Right. So we may or may not have clearly defined units, but for each unit we have, for example, having that same review process established, right, as a routine. Part of that routine is like each unit has different content, but the structure of the review activities can be similar, so students know what to expect.
And so when we say it's useful to come up with a routine for reviewing, it doesn't necessarily have to be, the exact same activity or the same exact process each time. But I do think that just knowing the format is going to be fairly similar for each unit is important. I think it serves us well to have these recurring activities.
It creates the space for learners to get comfortable, which then allows us to focus on the content instead of getting their buy-in.
Yeah. Now, maybe some of our listeners are thinking, but that's when learners start to maybe lose interest, right? Students might start getting comfortable with these activities, but they're not so engaged anymore because they're used to what we're doing. So now we have to make sure that we're presenting these activities and these processes in a way that's going to increase their engagement and be meaningful for them in this process.
Right. It can't just be like, pull out your book and read through what we've already done, or, open your notebooks and reread all of the notes you've taken, or even just, here's a handout. Let's spend the entire time silently, individually working on the handout and let me know if you have any questions.
Oh, right.
I mean, they might come up with some things, but if we don't take them through the steps of what we did in that unit or whatever, they might not come up with anything. And then it turns out after the assessment that they really actually did need some extra support on something they'd done.
So in my mind, I think to really maximize the power of reviewing activities, we have to make sure that the process allows for individual reflection and exploration so that students can perhaps, with our aid, specifically begin to identify gaps in their knowledge. So they're not just going to read their notes from a unit and say, oh, I don't know about this, or what about that? I mean, they might, but it's not going to be so natural. So we need to guide them through the process, structure reviewing in a way that helps them identify their gaps, making them really apparent to them and to us. And then from there, we can start to personalize and strategize about how to fill in those gaps. But this reflective learning doesn't just happen, right? That'd be great, but that's not the case. It has to be something that we establish as a foundation in our context so that when it comes time to be reflective in reviewing for an assessment, that practice is already there.
Yeah. We've talked about this metacognitive approach before. The students aren't just going to be aware of their gaps on their own. Fostering that awareness of one's own learning and what's missing is something that we build in. And so, as you say, we don't want them to just kind of blindly complete whatever reviewing we're doing. We want to leave the space for them to interrogate themselves. So asking questions within this process like, what is it that I do know? What is it that I don't know? What's my personal checklist? And what do I need to do to get to where I need to be for this upcoming assessment? And whether that's a paper test or an essay or a presentation or whatever other kind of assessment that you might have planned, this type of metacognitive approach is useful.
So one tool that I think has always been really helpful for me in creating this sort of reflective environment is having students start with a Kwl chart. What do you know? What do you want to know? And what have you learned? And so the structure just really, I think, fits into any setting, and it's something that you can do with any level of proficiency. If we're working, within a content area, or if we're working strictly on language, it allows that cultivation of reflective learning from the very beginning. And of course, this tool is really helpful for us as teachers because it's giving us a baseline to work with, understanding what our students need and where their interests lie. So in that way, we can make the learning more meaningful for them. But even more than that, this process is iterative in that we're asking students to reflect several times throughout our time with them. And so they're reflecting on what it is that they're actively learning in that moment.
What's interesting here is that you're not really talking about this KWL chart in the context of reviewing per se, but rather you're looking at it in the context of the entire course. Because if we give them a KWL chart, or if we ask them to figure out what their gaps in their knowledge are just then and there during the review session, like yeah, it could work. And to a certain extent, it does work. But it would be, I think, more powerful in the way you're describing. You start them with this sort of reflective piece before you breach a new topic or start a new unit, and during, and then also at the review stage, right? And so by the time they get to the review stage, they can look back at what they knew and didn't know before, which hopefully now they've learned and applied. You know, what they wanted to know and have learned, right?
Yeah. So I want to place emphasis on the fact that reviewing is not an isolated event. So with a KWL, we can use it within reviewing as an isolated event, but it really works best if we've applied it across the whole course, right? Holistically, like you mentioned earlier. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a KWL chart each time. We can just ask reflective questions that drive that same point. Just making sure that the students write down these ideas so that they can revisit them later.
So Shey, this framework has emphasized a sort of individual reflection, but I've come to learn that students need more interaction. So I wonder if you've ever tried to apply this strategy in a small group setting.
Totally. Actually, almost always. Something that I really love to do with students is have them sit together with their KWL charts or whatever reflection set and have them share with each other just the different aspects of the topic or go over the different pieces of material and just start to notice what their friends might have had in their learned column and what might be new to them or something that wasn't in their brain as something that they might have learned. And having them do it together will help them to fill in those gaps for each other.
I love that because, let's face it, presenting an activity as a review isn't always met with learner enthusiasm. So while an activity might be incredibly effective in getting learners to review and even build in that reflective learning piece, it also needs to hold their attention. And this is where we come to this making reviewing fun again. So, and I think, you know, group work can solve this issue. And there are just so many different formats for how we could do group work.
So whenever I think of group work, station rotations and Jigsaw come to mind.
Bingo.
I feel like those are the only two strategies that I use for my class because they're so effective. They're student-centered, right? So in my mind, at least, they're great for anything and everything.
And I think that what makes these two strategies really effective is that we can use them in person and also online.
You can. So in station rotations, you have a chunk of whatever you're reviewing at different stations throughout the room or in different breakout rooms. And so you can do it in a few different ways. Like you can have posters and physical groups where they're working together in the room, or you can divvy up the blackboard into different sections, or just have them in breakout rooms if you're online where they each have a different set of exercises that they're working on or a shared digital document that they're working on. And they have to go through each station before the end of that review session. So they're focusing on one component at a time and helping each other understand it. So you might have some kind of activity associated with each station, whether it's a game or a more straightforward activity. But while they're going through the stations together, they're really digging deep to try to understand the content.
Yes, I rely on station rotations a lot. That and Jigsaw too. We mentioned Jigsaw in episode 10 about simple but effective classroom routines. But to recap, Jigsaw is essentially when you have students break up into different groups and each group is assigned a small chunk of information to be the experts on. They work together within their groups to understand or review the concept, and then they pretty much teach the concept to the rest of the class, either in smaller groups or to the whole class. So instead of the teacher having to re-explain a concept, the students themselves guide the review.
Creating this sort of accountability for students to become experts on something is really helpful, I think, in identifying gaps in knowledge or misunderstandings, but also making, putting the onus on them and saying, instead of me just giving you something to read or this is everything you need to know for the test, you're putting the onus on them and saying, you figure out what's important here. That's your responsibility because you're the expert now.
Yeah. And so I think that this point about you're the expert, that's the important part here. And I think that's really the power of this group work and especially of Jigsaw. I actually really love using both Jigsaw and station rotation approaches together, particularly when it comes to grammar. So first, in this one class I taught, the students would break out into groups and do a Jigsaw with a review of how each structure we'd covered worked. So each group would have to explain one structure, and then they would go and do station rotation for each of those different topics. Essentially, they would first review the form and be the teachers who presented the review, and then they would go in the groups and actually practice the grammar in context. And of course, I would go around the breakout rooms just to make sure they were getting it.
Nice. Yeah, I love the idea of using both strategies in the same lesson, resulting in this sweet, layered review experience. Our listeners are like, sweet? Is it really that sweet, Shey? It is. It's sweet. I also appreciate the differentiation opportunities that come with group work. Like within their groups, once they finish the task, they have the option to do more activities if they're more advanced, maybe. When you throw some differentiation in there, students who feel like they had gotten it, they could move on in the time they had to do some additional activities.
Yeah, and some of our listeners might be thinking that multi-step reviewing processes are not for them. Maybe they're too complicated, maybe they're online, and logistically this all sounds like a nightmare. But there are always games.
Games!
Yeah.
Yeah. There are just so many different games that you can do. So what's your favorite, Anna?
Actually, one of my favorite games comes from the undergraduate ESL writing course that I taught and that you also taught, Shey. In the class, the students had learned to use different sentence combinations: simple, compound, complex, compound, complex, different subordinate clauses, etc. And so as a review activity, we would have this fun competition in which I would give them all a set of simple sentences that could then be connected logically in different ways. So they worked in teams on posters or for virtual on shared documents, and they had to have a minimum of each type of sentence and points for correctly connecting the sentences in a logical way with the right conjunction, or maybe it was a relative clause and whatnot. So they were working together and making all these combinations in their separate groups, and then we'd come together and review them. And as we were reviewing them, they'd be like, wait, why doesn't that work? And then we'd go over the kinds of clauses they were trying to use. And so it was a much more fun way than me having them sit down on their own and make boring sentence combinations. They got really, really competitive.
I'm sure. It sounds fun. Listeners, we've uploaded Anna's awesome sentence combining competition to our Teachers Pay Teachers account if you'd like to download it.
Hope you enjoy it.
Also, Anna, with this activity, I'm also imagining that could be something that you could very easily use with TPR or total physical response. So maybe you could have these sentences and clauses enlarged and you have them, I don't know, Velcroed or something to the board.
Oh.
And then you move things around, scramble everything up a bit, and the students have to come up to the board and move the semicolon. So now the sentence makes sense, right? So you could do it with commas or conjunctions.
Ooh, I hadn't thought of that, honestly. Having Velcro with the sentence chunks and the punctuation. I mean, I've definitely done a review specifically of punctuation, which is such a finicky thing to have to review.
Punctuation is just so different in different languages. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. But I like the idea of having punctuation be movable, like this Velcro idea. I've done it on a PowerPoint where they had to come over and show us on the projector where they would put the thing. But I like the idea of actually having it as a physical element.
And this strategy, I think, can be applied to pretty much anything. I know students really love to run back and forth to the board and move things around or fill in the blanks. And so this could be, it could be something related to new vocabulary, matching concepts to definitions. Maybe students start with a definition. They have to run up to the board and grab the right term before the other team grabs the term that they need. Working with adults, something that I would think was I have to just keep it simple. They'll be happy with just sitting. But it turns out that adults want to run around the classroom too.
Oh, yeah.
Board races have just always been very popular in my classes.
Yeah, they totally get into that stuff no matter what age.
Yeah. Another good review activity with vocabulary is taboo, right? Where someone has to describe the definition of a word and get another person to guess the word.
Love taboo. Put them in teams
Classic.
and have one team member describe the word with the rest of the team guessing. Another one I like is fill in the bleep, which asks students to write a sentence using a word, but instead of the word, they insert a blank, a bleep.
Nice. I always have them do like weird sounds instead of a bleep just to
It's
keep
fun.
it interesting. They hate it, but for me, it's fun anyway. What I appreciate in that approach is that it's even more practical. You're creating context rather than matching definitions to terms, which is pretty useless in the real world, right?
Reviewing can't just be like, do you know what this word means? It has to be, show me you can use this word or this structure effectively. But matching games can be helpful in increasing familiarity with concepts and reminding them at least of items they've already been exposed to.
And you know, there are some really great online tools for reviewing games. You have the oldies but goodies like Quizlet and Kahoot. Both of them you can use in class, and Quizlet you can have your students use independently.
And Nearpod. The matching game on Nearpod is really great. And there are a lot of other resources that have matching games, like, for example, WordWall. And for these two in particular, you can just get an account for free, and it can be a great way to engage your learners in the review process.
There are so many free resources out there and quality resources. I think that we have to do an entire episode on vocabulary games specifically, Anna.
We sure do, yeah.
So listeners, we'll stop there for now, but we'd love to hear from you. What are your go-to strategies for reviewing material in your classroom? And how are you integrating reviewing into the greater context of the course?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
For more resources related to today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud. Also, be sure to check out Anna's sentence combining competition at our Teachers Pay Teachers account. You can access that at teacherthinkaloud.com/support-us.
And of course, if you've appreciated anything you heard today, consider sharing this episode with a colleague and help expand our reach.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching.
And happy reflecting.
Ta-da!